Imagine you're holding a high-efficiency solar panel in one hand and a tarnished 16th century Spanish silver coin in the other.
Right, two completely different eras.
Exactly. On the surface, those two objects have absolutely nothing in common. I mean, one represents the absolute bleeding edge of our clean energy future, and the other is just a relic of this brutal, long-dead empire.
But there is a connection.
Yeah, if you look closely enough at the material they're both made of, you realize they are dripping with the exact same complicated, often really toxic history. So welcome to the deep dive.
It's great to be here.
I've been looking through this stack of source material all week, and honestly, it has completely broken my understanding of how global history actually functions.
A dense collection for sure.
Yeah, it really is. We have this sweeping, incredibly detailed document titled Silver, A Human Journey from Matter to Meaning, alongside some deeply analytical notes from a subpersonality named Tira. And our mission today, for you listening, is to take a single element from the periodic table atomic number 47 and examine how it became the hidden wiring of human civilization.
And it's a remarkable collection of sources, primarily because it just refuses to let us view silver simply as a shiny ornament.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this because the text establishes this fascinating concept right away. It calls it a double identity.
Yes, the double identity. Silver is both a tool and a treasure. I mean, it is something that belongs to the grime of the factory floor just as much as it belongs to the sterile silence of a bank vault.
It's working class and royalty all at once.
Exactly. The overarching theme we're pulling from these documents is that silver is essentially a moral mirror.
A moral mirror, I like that.
It reflects the most brilliant collaborative aspects of our species and simultaneously the absolute darkest, most exploitative depths we are willing to sink to, just to get what we want.
Which is a heavy thought, but whether you're a history buff, a science nerd, or just wildly curious, stick with us because this exploration is going to completely change how you view the hidden wiring of your everyday life.
Without a doubt.
I want to start by grounding this in the physical reality of the metal because the text uses this really beautiful phrase. It calls silver moonlight trapped in metal.
It's incredibly poetic.
It is. But then it immediately pivots to hard science. Scientifically, silver is a transition metal chemical symbol Ag from the Latin word argentum, meaning shining or white. But the source text zeroes in on the atomic level.
The electron configuration.
Yeah, it points to this highly specific configuration, bracket Kr, close bracket, 4 to 10, 5s1. I'm staring at that string of characters, and I have to admit, it just looks like a Wi-Fi password I would instantly forget. Walk me through why this specific atomic architecture is the engine for literally everything silver does.
Well, the secret lies entirely in that very last part, the 5s1.
Okay.
In chemistry, we look at how electrons orbit the nucleus of an atom in different shells or clouds. That first part, the Kr4010, that represents a very stable, tightly packed inner core of electrons.
Like a solid foundation.
Exactly. But then you have that solitary 5s1 electron sitting way out in the outermost shell. Because it's all alone, and so far from the positive pole of the nucleus, it's barely holding on. It's incredibly mobile.
So it's just out there wandering around.
Basically, yeah. When you pack billions of silver atoms together into a solid piece of metal, all of those lonely outer electrons basically detach from their specific parent atoms.
Whoa.
They form what physicists refer to as an electron gas. It's this free-flowing sea of negative charge that just washes over the rigid atomic structure.
So instead of rigid little solar systems, it's more like a network where everyone is constantly passing this one electron back and forth.
That's a great way to put it.
But exactly how does that translate to the real world, though? Like, why does a sea of electrons matter to a silversmith or an electrical engineer?
Because it translates to unmatched conductivity. If you apply an electrical voltage to a piece of silver, those free-floating electrons zip through the material almost instantly.
Because they're already detached.
Right, they encounter almost zero resistance. That is why silver holds the record for the highest electrical conductivity of any metal on the periodic table.
Wow.
And the exact same mechanism applies to heat. If you heat one end of a silver spoon, the kinetic energy is transferred by those same highly mobile electrons to the other end faster than in copper or even gold.
So that single loosely held electron is fundamentally why silver powers the modern world.
It is.
But the physical structure of the metal itself is what I'm kind of struggling to visualize. The document explains that silver atoms arrange themselves in a face-centered cubic crystal structure, or FCC.
Yes.
When I hear the word crystal, I immediately think of ice or diamonds, things that are brittle. If silver is a solid crystal lattice, why doesn't it just shatter into a million pieces when a blacksmith hits it with a heavy hammer?
It all comes down to how those atomic planes interact with each other. In a diamond, the carbon atoms are locked into these rigid, highly directional covalent bonds.
Very stiff.
Super stiff. So if you strike a diamond with a hammer, the force hits those rigid bonds. They can't bend, so they just snap, and the crystal shatters.
Makes sense.
But in silver's face-centered cubic structure, the atoms are arranged in these densely packed, uniform layers. And remember that sea of free-flowing electrons we just talked about?
The electron gas.
Right, that gas acts like a universal atomic lubricant.
Oh, I think I see where this is going. Is it sort of like one of those little plastic sliding tile puzzles, the ones where there's a missing square and you can slide the picture pieces around without taking the actual toy apart?
That is a perfect analogy. When you apply immense pressure to lignite by hitting it with a hammer or pulling it through a wire-drawing die, whole layers of atoms just slide smoothly past one another.
Without breaking.
The metallic bonds don't break. They just instantaneously reform in the new position, completely cushioned by that electron gas.
That is wild.
It really is. This is why you can take a lump of silver and beat it into a sheet so thin it's almost transparent, or draw it into miles of incredibly fine wire, and it just maintains its structural integrity. It has this miraculous combination of being durable, yet entirely yielding.
And on top of that, it has these optical and chemical properties that feel almost designed for human use. Like the text emphasizes its extreme reflectivity.
It's unmatched.
Yeah, before we figured out how to coat glass with modern aluminum, highly polished silver was the absolute premium standard for mirrors and early telescopes. It bounces back visible light with astonishing fidelity.
And then there's the biological aspect, which is fascinating.
Right. The source notes that silver ions actually disrupt microbial processes. So ancient peoples, without having any concept of germ theory whatsoever, knew that if they stored water in a silver vessel or just dropped a silver coin into a barrel of milk, it wouldn't spoil as quickly.
They recognized the utility long before they understood the actual mechanism.
How does it actually work biologically?
Well, the silver ions actually bind to the cell walls of bacteria. They interfere with their cellular respiration and reproduction.
So it literally suffocates the bacteria.
Effectively, yes. So you have a material that conducts electricity flawlessly, transfers heat perfectly, bends without breaking, reflects light immaculately, and actively sanitizes its own environment.
It's almost suspiciously useful.
It really is.
Which honestly makes the fact that it is so agonizingly difficult to pull out of the earth feel like some sort of cosmic joke. The text goes deep into the geological origins of silver, and we're talking about timescales that are just difficult for the human brain to even process.
Deep time.
Yeah, deep time. Let's dig into how a silver vein actually forms, because it doesn't just magically appear in the dirt. It requires intense hydrothermal activity.
It's a violent subterranean alchemy, and it takes hundreds of thousands, sometimes hundreds of millions of years.
Wow.
This usually occurs in tectonically active zones, places where the Earth's continental plates are grinding together or tearing apart, creating massive heat deep in the crust. You have these magma chambers miles below the surface.
And they're interacting with water.
Yes. This magma superheats underground reservoirs of water. We are looking at fluids exceeding 300 degrees Celsius, kept liquid only by the crushing pressure of the rock above them.
So it's like a subterranean pressure cooker?
Exactly. And these fluids become incredibly aggressive, highly acidic solvents. As they churn through the deep crust, they dissolve microscopic, trace amounts of metals from the surrounding rock. Silver, gold, copper, lead, zinc.
Okay, so you end up with this pressurized, boiling, highly acidic stew of liquid metals deep underground. How does that turn into a solid vein of silver a miner can actually hit with a pickaxe?
Well, the pressure inevitably forces those boiling fluids upward through any available fault lines or fractures in the crust.
Seeking the path of least resistance.
Right. And as the fluid rises toward the surface, the environment changes drastically. The temperature plummets and the pressure drops.
And it crystallizes.
Yes. In chemistry, when a solution cools, its ability to hold dissolved solids decreases. The metals can no longer remain suspended in the fluid. They precipitate out. They crystallize along the walls of the rock fractures, layer by layer over millennia, sealing the cracks with solid metal ores.
But the source material makes a point here that I found really confusing at first. It calls silver a gregarious metal, meaning it almost never crystallizes by itself. It drops out of the fluid alongside galena, which is a lead or sphalerite, a zinc ore, and chalcopyrite, a copper ore. Because of this, the text claims silver is primarily mined as a byproduct.
That's correct.
I don't fully grasp the economic implications of that. If the market is just screaming for silver, wouldn't someone just go open a dedicated silver mine?
You would assume so, right?
Yeah.
But what's fascinating here is that geology dictates economics in this case.
How so?
Roughly 70% of the global silver supply comes from mines that are actually targeting lead, zinc, or copper. The silver is just a chemical hitchhiker in the ore.
Just along for the ride.
Exactly. This creates a deeply structural anomaly in the global economy. I mean, gold is a dedicated market. If gold prices spike, companies aggressively expand gold mines. But silver is essentially an economic hostage to industrial-based metals.
An economic hostage. Okay, walk me through a scenario. Like, what does that actually look like?
Okay, imagine the global economy enters a severe recession. Construction halts, so the demand for copper wiring and zinc galvanized steel just collapses.
Right. Nobody's building houses.
Exactly.
Right.
So copper and zinc mines around the world scale back their operations or shut down entirely. As a direct consequence of that, the production of silver plummets because the silver was coming out of those copper and zinc mines.
Wait, really? So even if we need silver, we can't get it?
Right. The market might be absolutely desperate for silver for, say, medical devices or investment coins, but the supply is choked off because the base metal industry has stalled. Its supply simply cannot respond rationally to its own demand.
It's tethered to the heavy industrial muscle of civilization, whether it wants to be or not. That is so fascinating. But it leads me to another question about its place in history.
Yeah.
If silver has all these miraculous properties, and it hit this perfect sweet spot of scarcity, why didn't it become the ultimate currency above gold? Why did it remain the runner-up, the so-called middle child of the coinage metals?
It really boils down to finding the optimal scale for human daily life. The source compares silver's utility directly to gold and copper.
Right.
Copper was abundant and cheap, perfect for buying a beer at the local tavern, but it oxidized quickly and wasn't dense enough in value to store a family's life savings. You'd need a warehouse.
And gold.
Gold, on the other hand, was far too rare and valuable. It was the metal of statecraft, used for settling massive debts between empires. I mean, you couldn't use a gold coin to buy a loaf of bread.
Because it would be too small to hold.
Exactly. The necessary fraction of gold would be the size of a grain of sand, completely impossible to handle in everyday life.
So silver was kind of the Goldilocks metal, rare enough to hold significant concentrated wealth, but abundant enough that you could stamp it into a coin the size of your thumbnail and use it to pay a carpenter for a week's work.
Precisely. Silver was the engine of the middle economy. It bridged the gap between the peasant's copper and the emperor's gold. And because it became the indispensable medium for global trade, human beings decided it was worth enduring horrific conditions to extract it.
Which brings us to a transition in our source material that is, frankly, really difficult to read. The text states, "Beauty above ground often meant suffering below it."
It's a dark history.
Extremely. The history of silver extraction is just a chronicle of profound human misery. Let's look at the ancient methods first. Before heavy machinery, they relied on a technique called fire setting.
Fire setting was an incredibly brutal, brute force attack on the mountain itself. Miners would haul massive amounts of timber deep into these subterranean tunnels, stack it against the solid rock face, and set it ablaze.
Wow.
They would let the rock bake in this intense heat and then suddenly douse it with cold water. The violent thermal shock would cause the stone to fracture and splinter.
Just the physical reality of doing that, being miles underground, lighting a massive bonfire in a confined space, the smoke inhalation, the lack of oxygen, the constant risk of a tunnel collapse. It's a nightmare scenario.
And that was merely to get the rock out of the wall. Because silver is locked together with lead, as we discussed, ancient metallurgists had to figure out how to separate them.
Right, the cupellation process.
Yes. They used a process called cupellation. They would crush the ore, place it in a porous crucible, which was often made of bone ash, actually.
Bone ash. That's grim.
Very. And they'd heat it in a furnace to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the lead oxidizes. It essentially rusts into a liquid slag, which either evaporates into the air as a toxic fume or gets absorbed by the porous bone ash,
Leaving the silver.
leaving a small, shining button of pure silver behind in the crucible.
I mean, it's a metallurgical triumph for the time, but the human cost is just staggering. They were breathing in concentrated lead vapor. The heavy metal poisoning in those ancient mining communities must have been absolute devastation.
It certainly was.
But the text makes it clear that ancient mining, as brutal as it was just a prelude. The true horror of silver extraction was perfected during the imperial era. And we have to talk about Cerro Rico.
The Rich Hill.
Yeah, the rich hill in Potosi in present-day Bolivia. The Spanish Empire discovered silver there in 1545, and what unfolded literally changed the trajectory of the entire planet.
Potosi really defies modern comprehension. I mean, within a few decades of its discovery, this barren, freezing mountain in the high Andes exploded into a metropolis of over 150,000 people.
Which is huge for that time.
It became larger than London, Paris, or Madrid. It was an imperial boom town situated at over 13,000 feet of elevation, where the air is agonizingly thin. And the entire purpose of this city's existence was to feed the Spanish crown's insatiable addiction to bullion.
And they didn't just stumble upon the silver either. They ripped it from the earth using a labor apparatus that is chilling in its mechanical cruelty. The Spanish authorities co-opted an existing Incan system called the mita.
Yes, the mita.
Originally, if I'm reading this right, the mita was a form of communal labor for public works, like building roads or temples. But the Spanish weaponized it into a forced labor draft.
They absolutely did. The Spanish colonial administrators required indigenous communities from across a vast geographical region to send a strict quota of their able-bodied men to work in the mines of Potosi for a year at a time.
A year!
They were marched hundreds of miles from their homes. And once inside Cerro Rico, the conditions were hellish. Men were forced to climb up and down these sheer vertical shafts on primitive ladders made of twisted rawhide.
Carrying the ore.
Yes, carrying heavy canvas sacks filled with hundreds of pounds of jagged ore strapped to their foreheads and backs. They worked in suffocating heat, in near-total darkness, breathing a thick soup of silica dust.
That's horrifying.
The mortality rate from falls, exhaustion, and silicosis, which is a horrific lung disease caused by inhaled stone dust, was simply catastrophic.
And the cruelty actually compounded when the easy surface ore ran out. The text details a massive technological shift here. Originally, the indigenous workers used these traditional wind-powered Andean furnaces called guayas to smelt the high-grade silver.
Right.
But by the 1570s, they had completely exhausted the rich veins. They were left with mountains of low-grade rock that the guayas just couldn't process.
So, the Spanish faced an economic crisis. They had an ocean of low-grade ore and no way to extract the silver. So they imported a new chemical technique, the patio process.
The mercury process.
Yes, this relied on mercury amalgamation, and this is the exact moment where the environmental and human devastation of Potosi scales up to apocalyptic levels.
I need to understand the mechanics of this because the text describes it vividly, but the chemistry is baffling to me. How does adding liquid mercury to dirt pull out solid silver?
Well, they would take the low-grade ore and use massive water-powered mills to grind it down into a fine powdery silt.
Yes.
They'd spread this crushed rock out over enormous stone-paved courtyards, the patios. Then they would mix in salt, copper sulfate, and vast shimmering pools of liquid mercury. The mercury actually acts as a solvent for the silver. Under the right chemical conditions, the mercury atoms will literally bond with the silver atoms hidden in the rock, pulling them out of the mineral matrix to form a silver-mercury alloy, or an amalgam.
But this mixture didn't just sit there on the patio, right?
No, it had to be agitated. And that is where the mita laborers came in. Indigenous men, and sometimes mules, were forced to wade bare-legged into this toxic sludge, stomping and churning the mixture for weeks under the freezing Andean sun, just to ensure the mercury came into contact with every single particle of silver.
My God. So they are absorbing mercury directly through their skin.
Yes.
And then once they finally managed to get the mercury and silver to bond into this amalgam, how did they separate them?
They gathered the amalgam and placed it in specialized retorts, or ovens. They applied intense heat, which caused the mercury to boil and vaporize.
Because mercury boils at a lower temperature than silver.
Exactly. The mercury gas would waft away or be recaptured if the equipment was advanced enough, though much of it just escaped, leaving behind pure sponge-like silver.
But that means the workers tending these ovens were breathing in concentrated, superheated mercury vapor.
The neurotoxicity was absolute. Mercury vapor passes effortlessly through the lungs and directly into the bloodstream and the brain. The workers suffered severe neurological degeneration, uncontrollable tremors, tooth loss, kidney failure, and agonizing deaths. The Spanish essentially treated indigenous lives as consumable fuel for the extraction process.
And the landscape suffered equally, right?
Immensely. Tens of thousands of tons of mercury were permanently lost into the local environment, seeping into the soil and the river systems, poisoning the entire region's ecology for centuries.
It is a devastating realization. So, to you listening, let me ask you, when you look at a beautiful, ornate, antique silver mirror or a delicately crafted chalice in a museum, do you ever think about the mercury and the broken mountain behind it? The shine completely obfuscates the violence of its creation.
The text calls this the ethical paradox of silver.
How so?
It makes wealth portable. You can mint a coin in the Andes and ship it to a palace in Europe. But the extraction makes the suffering local. The environmental wound and the human toll remain permanently anchored to the geography where the metal was born. Potosi was just a massive apparatus for converting geological wealth and human life into pure, circulating capital.
And as we move forward in history, the fundamental dynamic of extraction remains brutal, even as the technology evolves.
Right.
The text jumps from the colonial era to the industrial boom towns of the 19th century United States, specifically the Comstock lode in Nevada. Here, we see the transition from the lone prospector with a pickaxe to massive corporate extraction.
The Comstock lode, discovered in 1859, was the first major silver discovery in the U.S. It birthed Virginia City, a quintessential boomtown built entirely on frenzy, speculation, and instant wealth.
But the easy stuff doesn't last.
Never. Surface deposits are exhausted quickly. To chase the silver veins thousands of feet underground, you need deep shaft mining. You need massive steam-powered pumps to constantly drain millions of gallons of boiling water from the deep tunnels. You need industrial hoists, miles of timbering, and industrial stamp mills to crush the rock.
And the independent miner with his little pan and pickaxe cannot afford a steam-powered pump.
Precisely. So capital moves in. Corporations take over. The independent prospector became a wage laborer for massive mining conglomerates.
And that changes the whole social dynamic.
It fundamentally altered the social fabric of the American West. The corporations built company towns. They owned the land, the housing, the local store where miners bought their food on credit, and they even controlled the local law enforcement.
A total monopoly on their lives.
Yes, the miners were locked into a system of intense exploitation, performing highly dangerous work involving dynamite, rock falls, and underground fires.
Which naturally leads to massive pushback. The source highlights that these heavily concentrated, highly dangerous corporate mining towns actually became the crucibles for the modern labor movement. Because when a single corporation owns your livelihood and the town you live in, your only leverage is to strike together. The battles for the 8-hour workday, basic safety regulations, and fair wages were often fought and bled for in these silver and copper mining camps.
Absolutely.
And even today, the text outlines how modern extraction, while heavily mechanized, carries an immense lingering shadow. We've replaced men with pickaxes, with autonomous haul trucks the size of houses, and massive open-pit mines that literally erase mountains.
It's extraction on a planetary scale.
Yeah. And the chemical processing has shifted to a method called froth flotation. Now, I actually need you to explain this one, because bubbling air through a tank of rock sounds more like making a latte than industrial mining.
It is an ingenious, if chemically intense, process. You crush the ore into a fine powder and mix it with water to create a slurry. Then, you add specific chemical reagents. Often these are petroleum-derived chemicals called collectors.
Okay, collectors, what do they do?
These chemicals selectively bind to the surface of the silver-bearing minerals, making those specific particles hydrophobic, meaning they repel water.
Okay.
Then, you pump air into the bottom of the tank to create millions of tiny bubbles.
So the hydrophobic silver particles trying to escape the water latch onto the rising air bubble.
Exactly. The silver-laden minerals ride the bubbles to the surface, creating this thick metallic froth that is constantly skimmed off the top, while the worthless rock, the tailings, just sinks to the bottom.
That's clever.
It is highly efficient for extracting trace amounts of metal from low-grade ore. But the environmental footprint is massive.
Especially regarding the waste left behind. The text points to something called acid mine drainage as one of the most insidious legacies of hard rock mining. It describes a process where digging up the rock literally creates acid out of thin air and water. How does that even happen?
When you excavate a massive open pit, you are exposing millions of tons of deep rock to oxygen and rain for the first time in geological history. Much of this rock contains sulfide minerals like pyrite or fool's gold.
Right.
When these sulfides react with air and water, a natural chemical oxidation occurs that produces sulfuric acid.
So the waste rock piles and the abandoned tunnels just become giant, slow-drip acid generators.
Yes, and that highly acidic water then percolates through the remaining waste rock, acting as a powerful solvent. It leaches out heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and the remaining traces of silver.
And that gets into the water supply.
This toxic, heavy metal-laden acid runoff can continuously poison local watersheds, rivers, and groundwater for decades, sometimes centuries, after a mine has ceased operations. It is a slow-motion environmental catastrophe that requires perpetual water treatment to manage.
It's just a relentless cycle of disruption. But the reason we engage in this disruption, the reason we tear open the earth and endure this human and environmental cost, leads us to the core of our source's historical argument. The silver that emerged from the horrors of Potosi and the Comstock lode didn't just sit in a vault. It went to work. It literally stitched the world together.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, when a material becomes that central to human ambition, when empires rely on it to wage war and merchants rely on it to cross oceans, it transcends its physical properties.
Yeah.
It becomes the foundational architecture of trust.
Trust.
The text makes a profound observation here. Money is never just metal. It is a physical manifestation of a promise. It is an agreement between strangers.
It's a way to externalize human trust into a portable form. The source traces this evolution all the way from antiquity. In ancient Mesopotamia, they used raw, weighed pieces of silver as a unit of account to track debts and agricultural yields. Then the Greeks systematized it, minting the silver drachma using metal from the Laurian mines near Athens.
Yes, standardization.
And by 211 BCE, the Romans introduced the silver denarius, which became the economic lifeblood of the entire Mediterranean basin. They took a shiny rock, stamped a ruler's face on it, and turned it into a standardized unit of public trust.
Exactly.
A Roman general could march an army into Gaul, buy supplies from local merchants, and maintain discipline purely because everyone, from the emperor down to the blacksmith, agreed on the abstract value of that little silver disc.
And that standard of portable trust echoed through the centuries. Look at the origin of the British currency, the pound sterling.
Oh, I loved this part.
The text explains that in the Anglo-Saxon period, a pound was quite literally a pound weight of silver, which was divided into 240 individual silver pennies. To ensure the coins didn't wear down too quickly in circulation, they standardized the sterling alloy at 92.5% pure silver and 7.5% copper for structural durability.
Which we still use today for jewelry.
Exactly. That exact metallurgical standard became the linguistic and economic anchor of the British Empire.
But the true world-altering explosion of silver's power happens in the 16th century. This is the moment silver becomes the first true global commodity. I look at this era and I think of silver as the first real global internet protocol.
An internet protocol.
Yeah. You know how today the TCP/IP standards allow a server in Tokyo to seamlessly share data with a smartphone in Brazil? They establish a universal language. In the 1500s, silver was the universal protocol that allowed entirely different cultures, vast empires, and distinct regional economies to finally plug into one another and talk on a global scale.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The bandwidth of that 16th century protocol was the sheer tonnage of silver bullion flowing out of the Spanish Americas. A river of silver flowed eastward across the Atlantic to Spain.
To fund their wars, right?
Yes, the Habsburg monarchy used this massive influx of wealth to fund endless, sprawling religious and dynastic wars across Europe. But crucially, an equally massive river of silver flowed westward across the Pacific Ocean.
The Manila galleons. I find this part of the history absolutely staggering from a logistical perspective. We are talking about the 1500s. These were massive, incredibly unwieldy wooden sailing ships packed to the brim with silver bullion, attempting to navigate the vast, uncharted expanse of the Pacific Ocean from Acapulco, Mexico, all the way to Manila in the Philippines.
It was incredibly dangerous.
The storms, the scurvy, the piracy, the sheer audacity of trying to move thousands of tons of metal across the planet in a wooden box.
The risks were astronomical. But the economic gravity pulling those ships across the ocean was just irresistible. Waiting for the Spanish galleons in Manila were fleets of merchants from Ming Dynasty China, their holds packed with silk, porcelain, and tea.
A perfect trade.
The Spanish had the silver, the Chinese had the manufactured goods the European elites desperately craved.
But the source text goes deeper into why China wanted the silver so badly. It describes China as a suction pump for global bullion. Why couldn't the Ming emperor just print paper money or use copper coins? Why was silver the only thing they would accept?
Well, the Ming Dynasty had previously experimented with paper fiat currency, but they severely overprinted it, which led to catastrophic hyperinflation.
Ah, so trust was broken.
Completely. The paper money became worthless, and the public lost all faith in it. So to stabilize the massive imperial economy, the Ming government instituted sweeping tax reforms. Most notably, the Single Whip Law in 1581. They consolidated all the various taxes which were previously paid in grain, woven silk, or forced peasant labor into a single tax that had to be paid in raw silver.
So overnight, millions of Chinese citizens suddenly have to acquire silver just to pay their taxes and survive.
The demand exploded, but China didn't possess enough domestic silver mines to meet this sudden, massive internal demand. Because it was so scarce and so desperately needed, the purchasing power of silver in China was significantly higher than it was in Europe or the Americas. Global trade fundamentally reorganized itself to arbitrate that difference.
It just naturally flowed there.
Silver flowed inexorably toward where it was most highly valued.
It really is globalization in its purest, rawest form. You have an indigenous miner in the high Andes of Bolivia suffering under the brutal META system, completely economically locked to a peasant farmer in Ming China who needs silver to pay his imperial taxes, and both of them are enriching a banker in Genoa who is financing the Spanish galleons. The scale of human interconnection is breathtaking.
It was the dawn of the modern world economy. But the text also highlights the inherent vulnerability of this interconnectedness. Silver made power portable, but it also made it uncontrollable.
Okay.
Spain commanded mountains of silver, but because they lacked a strong domestic manufacturing base, they spent it all importing goods from other European nations and fighting foreign wars. The silver hemorrhaged out of Spain's borders, flooding the coffers of Dutch, English, and French merchants.
And more money means inflation.
Precisely. This sudden, massive influx of circulating silver across Europe caused severe inflation. It's a period known as the price revolution. The cost of basic goods skyrocketed, which devastated the purchasing power of the lower classes and destabilized entire societies.
And the political friction caused by the silver supply didn't just stay in the colonial era. The source text leaps forward to the 19th century United States to examine the ferocious debates over bimetallism and free silver. This wasn't just some dry academic debate about central banking. This was explosive, visceral class warfare fought through the proxy of metal.
It was a fundamental battle over who controls the value of money and therefore who holds economic power. And the text lays out both sides very clearly. On one side, you had rural farmers, debtors, and Western mining syndicates. They championed free silver, the demand that the U.S. government coin unlimited amounts of silver.
To create inflation, right.
Their logic was straightforward. If you flood the market with silver coins, you expand the money supply. This induces inflation. And if you are a farmer drowning in mortgage debt, inflation is your best friend.
Because your debt effectively shrinks.
Because it means the dollars you use to pay back your loan are worth less than when you originally borrowed them.
And on the exact opposite side of the battlefield, you have the East Coast financial elite, the bankers, and the creditors. They demanded adherence to a strict gold standard. They wanted to keep the money supply incredibly tight and constrained because deflation protects the immense value of the debts owed to them.
The battle over silver was really a battle over whether the national economy would prioritize the debtor or the creditor, the rural producer or the urban financier. Silver was right in the middle, the fulcrum upon which American class politics teetered for decades.
When a material becomes that central to human survival, when a farmer in Nebraska or a merchant in Beijing relies on it to feed their family, it stops being just a metal. It burrows its way past our wallets and deep into our psychology. It enters our myths. The source material pivots here to explore the rich, symbolic life of silver, and it sets up a powerful cross-cultural dichotomy between gold and silver.
The text notes that across wildly different cultures, a consistent symbolic language emerges. Gold is universally associated with the sun. It represents kingship, absolute dominance, warmth, and unyielding permanence. Gold doesn't tarnish, it doesn't change, it simply declares its own value.
But silver is different.
Silver is deeply associated with the moon. It is often feminine-coded. It represents intuition, reflection, ambiguity, and the subtle shifting changing of the light. Silver's pale, cool glow resembles moonlight. If gold is the tyrannical emperor who commands from the throne, silver is the quiet philosopher who observes from the shadows.
That emotional middle ground gives silver enormous symbolic flexibility in our storytelling. You see this flexibility everywhere in folklore. The text specifically brings up the concept of the silver bullet killing the werewolf. Now, I've watched 100 horror movies, and I have never actually stopped to ask, why silver? Why not an iron bullet or a gold spear?
It's highly symbolic.
The text unpacks this brilliantly. The werewolf is the ultimate symbol of uncontrolled instinct, the savagery of nature, a terrifying corruption of humanity. But silver represents purity, incorruptibility, and the sacred, rational order of civilization.
When the hero fires a silver bullet into the monster, it is a profoundly symbolic act. It is the organized, refined order of human civilization striking down the chaotic savagery of the natural world.
It's man-conquering beast.
Yes. And you see the same logic applied to vampires and evil spirits. Historically, people believed that silver amulets or silver crosses repelled dark magic because the flawless, reflective surface of polished silver was seen as a literal manifestation of divine clarity and untouched truth. Evil, which relies on deception and shadow, cannot withstand the pure reflection of silver.
That concept of reflection is baked right into our linguistics, too. I mean, we use idioms every day without thinking about their metallic origins. We talk about finding the silver lining, this idea of discovering resilience and hope within suffering, because even the darkest, most ominous storm clouds catch a glint of light on their edges.
Or class distinctions.
Right. We describe someone inheriting wealth by saying they were born with a silver spoon, pointing directly to the historical reality that ornate silver tableware was the ultimate dividing line of class and privilege. If someone is eloquent and persuasive, we call them silver-tongued, linking the metal to refined intellect and smooth, valuable speech.
Yet the source is careful to highlight that silver symbolism is deeply morally ambiguous. There's a profound shadow side to the metal, perfectly encapsulated by the phrase, 30 pieces of silver.
From the biblical story of Judas's betrayal, I really struggled with this part of the analysis at first. It points out that 30 pieces of silver is a bizarrely small amount of money for the ultimate betrayal. Why didn't the story use a chest of gold or a massive kingdom? So what does this all mean?
Well, the text argues that the smallness of the sum is precisely the point. It highlights the banality of human temptation. Silver is valuable enough to tempt you to betray your deepest principles or someone you love, but it is small enough, mundane enough, to leave you feeling immense, crushing shame afterward.
It's relatable.
It isn't a kingdom. It's just 30 heavy coins in a purse. The temptation is tragically common, which makes the moral failure feel all the more human and devastating.
It also speaks to the distinct class psychology of the metal. The text explains that gold was for the rulers, locked away in state treasuries. But silver was the metal of the upper middle class, the wealthy merchants, the clergy, the skilled professionals. Owning silver plates or candlesticks meant you had ascended into civilization.
But for the working poor,
For the working poor, silver wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was existential reality. A silver coin was literal survival. It was next month's rent. It was firewood for the winter. The elites looked at silver and saw beauty and status. The workers looked at silver and saw the fragile barrier between themselves and starvation.
and the physical nature of silver perfectly aligns with this complex philosophical meaning. Consider mirrors.
Mirrors, right.
Because highly polished silver was historically used to back the finest mirrors, the metal became inextricably linked to the concepts of the soul, self-knowledge, and vanity. A silver mirror is merciless. It returns truth, it does not radiate its own light. It forces humanity to look at its own reflection.
And crucially, unlike gold, which remains pristine forever, silver tarnishes. It reacts with the microscopic sulfur compounds in the air. It grows dark. It develops a thick black patina. The text uses this as a profound metaphor. Silver represents the moral life because brightness requires care. Brightness requires care. I love that framing. Relationships, trust, public institutions, they are like silver. If you don't actively tend to them, if you don't apply friction and polish them continuously, they will slowly darken and corrupt in the atmosphere of everyday life. It feels like a profoundly human metal because it is vulnerable to its environment.
A very apt metaphor.
But while we no longer use silver to fend off mythical werewolves, and our central banks don't back our paper money with it anymore, we haven't abandoned the moon metal. Not by a long shot. It hasn't disappeared, it has simply moved into hiding. And that reality drags us out of the realm of folklore and into the invisible infrastructure of the modern world.
The shift in how humanity utilizes silver over the last century is staggering. Historically, the vast majority of silver was minted into currency, forged into tableware, or during the 20th century, consumed by the photography industry.
For film, right.
Yes, silver halides are highly sensitive to light, which made silver the absolute irreplaceable cornerstone of photographic film and medical X-rays. But as the world transitioned to digital cameras and fiat currencies unbacked by metal, you might logically assume that silver's economic importance would plummet.
But the exact opposite happened. The text details how industrial demand for silver is currently skyrocketing to unprecedented levels. Silver has effectively become the invisible nervous system of modern high-tech civilization. We are talking about the explosive growth of electric vehicles, advanced aerospace guidance components, and the massive AI data centers currently being built around the world.
Because of its conductivity.
Exactly. Because silver is the absolute best conductor of electricity on the planet, any technology that requires flawless, highly efficient, and reliable electrical contacts needs silver. Even the medical field is finding new uses, employing antimicrobial silver ion coatings on surgical equipment and catheters to drastically reduce hospital-acquired infections.
But the single most dominant force driving this new era of industrial demand is the transition to renewable energy, specifically the solar panel industry.
Solar panels use silver.
Heavily, photovoltaic cells rely fundamentally on highly conductive silver paste. This paste is screen printed onto the silicon wafers to capture the electrons generated by sunlight and efficiently channel that electrical current out to the grid.
I had no idea.
The text cites a recent 2024 report from the Silver Institute that paints a stark picture. The global silver market is currently operating in a massive structural deficit. Last year alone, global supply fell short of demand by an astonishing 148.9 million ounces, driven almost entirely by the insatiable appetite of the green energy sector.
Which has triggered a desperate scramble for what the text calls urban mining. We are realizing we have to aggressively recycle silver out of dead iPhones, discarded medical scrap, and decommissioned solar panels.
Because substitution isn't working.
Right. The engineers have tried to engineer silver out of the equation. They call it silver thrifting, trying to substitute cheaper metals like copper or aluminum into the solar panels to cut costs. But the text notes they are hitting hard thermodynamic limits. Copper just isn't conductive enough, and aluminum oxidizes too easily, creating electrical resistance. If you want a solar panel or an EV battery management system to operate at maximum efficiency, you need atomic number 47. You can't fake it with a cheaper metal.
And this raises an important question. It introduces the most uncomfortable tension in the entire source text. It describes it as the green paradox.
The green paradox. Let's get into that.
We all universally recognize the existential urgency of decarbonizing our global economy. We need to build millions of acres of solar arrays and transition our transportation fleet to electric vehicles. But green energy infrastructure is not magically immaterial. It must be built from massive quantities of disturbed Earth.
Let's slow down on this point because the paradox is heavy. We want a pristine, high-tech, climate-friendly future. But to build that clean future, we need astronomical amounts of silver. And acquiring that silver means aggressively expanding industrial mining. It means tearing open new, massive open pit mines. It means more millions of tons of rock ground into dust, more toxic tailings ponds, and a higher risk of acid mine drainage.
Yes.
The text specifically points out that this is triggering severe water conflicts right now in arid regions like the Andes Mountains. Mining companies are moving in and competing directly with local indigenous agriculture for incredibly scarce water resources just to process the ore. I read this and I have to ask, are we just repeating the brutal history of Potsy with better PR?
It's a valid comparison.
We want shiny new solar panels on our roofs and AI algorithms on our phones, but we are completely ignoring the massive toxic holes we are tearing into the earth and the local communities we are displacing to get the raw materials. We haven't solved the problem of extraction. We've just displaced the suffering to the invisible start of the supply chain.
It is a profound, unresolved moral challenge. We are attempting to build an ecologically sustainable future using inherently unsustainable extractive methods. This paradox has created what the text describes as a schizophrenic global market for silver.
Schizophrenic? How so?
Well, on one side of the market, silver is being aggressively consumed by industrial demand, pulled forward to build the solar grids and data centers of the future. But on the other side, it is still being fiercely hoarded by traditional investment demand. When geopolitical tensions rise, or when people fear runaway inflation or banking collapses, ancient human instincts kick in.
They buy metal.
Investors rush to buy physical silver bars and coins as a historical safe haven, a tangible store of value. So silver is violently caught between the high-tech factory of the future and the paranoid vault of our ancient fears.
It's wild to think about. Whether you are looking at a 16th century Spanish galleon desperately trying to haul bullion across a storm-tossed Pacific, or a 21st century megacorporation building a massive solar array in the desert, our fundamental relationship with silver really hasn't changed. We still ruthlessly demand the utility of the metal, and we still try our hardest to look away from the cost of getting it.
We haven't evolved past that dynamic.
Which brings us to the ultimate philosophical conclusion of our source material. What does this deep dive into atomic number 47 actually reveal about us?
Taylor's analytical notes in the source material synthesize this journey beautifully. Taylor suggests that the deepest, truest meaning of silver isn't wealth, and it isn't conductivity. The true meaning of silver is mediation.
Mediation.
Silver acts as the great mediator between the raw geology of the Earth and the complex structures of human society. It mediates between brutal physical labor and refined artistic beauty, between rigorous empirical science and deep psychological myth. The story of silver proves that human beings are, at our absolute core, meaning-making creatures.
We literally locate a specific arrangement of protons and electrons buried miles underground inside a rock. We drag it out into the light, and we collectively, imaginatively agree to transform it into a unit of currency to fund wars, a medicine to kill bacteria, a magical talisman to fight off monsters, a symbol of the divine moon, and the invisible conduit for artificial intelligence. The metal itself doesn't possess any inherent desire to be a coin or a solar panel. We project the entire weight of our civilization's ambition onto it.
We use silver as a tool to compress deep planetary time. We take a metal that required hundreds of millions of years of patient subterranean hydrothermal pressure to crystallize, and we ruthlessly force it to serve the frantic, immediate urgency of human progress. There's a gorgeous, lingering quote from Tira's notes that summarizes this entire duality. Wisdom is not a sword, but a lantern.
That is a stunning phrase.
Silver is fundamentally a light-bearing material. It is beautiful, undeniably useful, incredibly dangerous, and ultimately revealing. It doesn't conquer the world like iron or steel, it illuminates it. It perfectly reflects humanity's absolute brilliance, our capacity to cooperate across oceans, to build intricate global trade networks, to unravel the quantum secrets of atomic structures, and to harness the energy of the sun itself.
But a mirror reflects everything.
It does. It also reflects our absolute worst impulses, our insatiable greed, our historical willingness to enslave and draft forced labor, our reckless destruction of delicate ecosystems, and our terrifying capacity to poison the very earth and water we depend on for survival.
It is the ultimate middle child of the elemental world. It lacks the forceful, world-breaking brutality of iron, the metal of industry and weaponry, and it lacks the mythic, tyrannical permanence of gold, the metal of emperors. Silver is the observer. It is the diplomat. It's the quiet, indispensable engineer working frantically behind the drywall, keeping the electrical grids humming and the global economy flowing.
But as the text implies, it requires distance to work its magic on our conscience.
Right.
The further the polished silver ring or the sleek new solar panel travels from the point of its violent extraction, the further it gets from the toxic tailings pond, the acid runoff, and the exhausted miner, the easier it is for civilization to make the suffering invisible. We gaze into the silver mirror and we proudly see the reflection of our own technological and economic progress, while we purposefully, conveniently ignore the shadow of the mountain we destroyed to make the mirror.
That is the tragedy and the triumph of human civilization, permanently fused together within a single transition metal. Silver does not make us inherently good or bad. It simply magnifies our intentions. It makes us larger, and in doing so, it forces us to eventually live with the massive consequences of our own scale.
Exactly.
What an unbelievable journey this text has taken us on. We started in the violent, unfathomable heat of an exploding supernova forging atomic number 47. We descended deep into the pressurized, boiling hydrothermal vents of the Earth's crust to watch it crystallize over millennia. We traced its violent extraction through the terrifying, claustrophobic tunnels of antiquity and the horrific, mercury-poisoned meta-labor drafts of Potosi.
It's quite a path.
We watched it fund global empires, survive the perilous Pacific crossing in Manila galleons, trigger fierce political class wars over bimetallism, and inspire enduring folklore of werewolves and silver linings. And now we see it quietly hiding inside the very device you are using to listen to this deep dive right now, flawlessly conducting the electrical pulses that power our modern existence.
The story's silver is simply humanity's story writ small. We dig value out of the dark earth, we stamp it with our fragile authority, we trade it across vast oceans, we sanctify it in our temples, we weaponize it in our myths, we industrialize it inside our machines, and finally we sit back and ask ourselves what it all meant. And the answer is always looking right back at us from the polished surface. The real monster in the folklore was never the werewolf.
What was it then?
It was the uniquely human habit of seeing the shine and conveniently forgetting the cost. The next time you look into a mirror or tap a glass screen or flip a light switch, remember what you are actually touching. You are interacting with millions of years of compressed geological time, layered thickly with unimaginable human triumph and devastating human suffering. Silver reflects us perfectly, without judgment. The only question left is whether you can bear to look at the reflection.